From Connecticut Public Radio in Hartford, this is Audacious. I'm Kyone Wolfe in a convenience store as a young teenager. It's the 90s. The clerk is totally absorbed in his Nintendo Game Boy. He doesn't even look at me when I come in. I am passing the rack with the candy bars, and that Three Musketeers bar is glistening. I start doing moral algebra in my head. The tag says $1.49. What did the store pay for it? Like 50 cents? They won't miss it. And the dude isn't even looking. And if I take it and he does notice, what's he gonna do? Hop over the counter to chase me down over a frickin' Three Musketeers? Yeah, right. I deserve it. Anyway, I never get a break. I could just pick it up and drop it in my pocket. I could get away with it, right? Right? It's safe to say that many people wrestle with this mindset at least a few times in their youth. It's a weird phase that kind of comes and goes, but usually it just stays gone. But some people become addicted to stealing, which can be really hard to study. I mean, it's tough to talk about kleptomania, which is often seen only as a moral issue. But today, you'll hear that sometimes there's a lot more nuance to it. The compulsion to steal often occurs together with other mental health conditions, and consequences may at times do more harm than good. In a little bit, you'll hear from a woman who says that her eating disorder was connected with her stealing. Now she helps other people understand the scope of their condition and tries to help them break the cycle. And you'll meet one man who became addicted to stealing and then went on to help others in recovery. He started a support group for people who share this compulsion, and he became the CEO of an organization that helps people safely pay back money to stores they've stolen from. But first, Dr. Mark Potenza is a board-certified psychiatrist at Yale University with training and certification in addiction psychiatry. And his research is focused on the neurobiology and treatment of disorders characterized by impaired impulse control, like kleptomania. Kleptomania is a rare impulse control disorder affecting about 0.6% of the U.S. population, which is roughly 2 million people, according to the National Institutes of Health. So let's start with the basics. I asked Dr. Potenza, what is kleptomania?
So kleptomania is a formal diagnostic psychiatric condition that can be found in the main nomenclature systems of mental health concerns. So, for example, the American Psychiatric Association generates what is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's now in its 5th edition, and so it goes by the name DSM-5. And there is a category of impulse control disorders that has undergone revisions from DSM-4, the 4th edition, to DSM-5. It's currently now listed as disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders. And this is a category that includes intermittent explosive disorder, which is difficulties controlling temper, so becoming angry with minor provocation and acting aggressively in those settings. It also includes pyromania, repetitive fire setting, and it includes kleptomania, as well as several other disorders. So what is kleptomania? It's a behavioral pattern of stealing that is often done to relieve tension or anxiety. People have this growing tension that can only be relieved by the stealing behavior. The stealing is not done for necessity. Oftentimes, these are items that people do not need. They may sometimes collect and hoard them, but oftentimes they may give them away or even return them to the store. It does need to be distinguished from other patterns of stealing behavior. People can go and steal for personal gain, but this is something that one needs to look at when making a diagnosis of kleptomania.
What do we know about how this happens? Is this a result of something that happened in someone's childhood, something they saw in a movie? Is this a chemical thing?
So probably all of the above. Data suggests that for psychiatric conditions in general, there are often genetic contributions, environmental contributions that may be things like early life trauma, co-occurring mental health concerns, and then other factors that may contribute or influence the development. And this appears to be the case of kleptomania, which I would say is less well understood than some of the other psychiatric conditions.
Why do you think it's less understood?
One, it's relatively rare in the general population. So the estimates are well less than 1% of the general population. There may be other factors that contribute. For example, we do a lot of research of impulse control disorders or disorders that may also be characterized as behavioral addictions, things like gambling disorder, gaming disorder, and other conditions. And there really isn't an institute at the National Institutes of Health that focuses on these disorders as a main area of research focus.
What do we know about demographics, the kind of people who tend to become kleptomaniacs?
We do know some things. Women are more likely than men to experience kleptomania. It's estimated to be about a 3-to-1 female to male ratio, which is unusual for this larger category of conditions. The disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders group is largely conditions that are male predominant. So kleptomania is somewhat different in this regard.
What do you think people get wrong about kleptomania?
There are things that I think people may quote unquote get wrong with mental health conditions in general. So there's often stigma that is associated with mental health concerns. And I think this is even more pronounced for addictions, as well as conditions that may violate people's rights or go against social norms. And kleptomania falls into that group. And therefore, people may believe that these are quote unquote bad people. And they may feel ostracized or stigmatized in ways that where people have not had the condition may be difficult for people to understand.
Not a ton of compassion for this particular mental health condition.
Yeah, I think it would be good for us all to have more compassion towards one another.
Can you talk about age when it comes to kleptomania? Because I think about how, I have definitely stolen. I remember when I was a little kid, I stole a ring from a gift shop, and my mom saw me playing with it in the backseat of the car, and I got in trouble for it. When I was 14, I stole a Tigger t-shirt from Disney World and got arrested. That was stupid. Made for a good story, but it was still stupid. And I know that's not kleptomania, but a lot of people recognize that the younger you are, the more likely you are to steal. What do we know about age when it comes to kleptomania?
I think you're raising a very important point of the developmental aspects in terms of understanding what is right and wrong. There's also the period of adolescence where it's a period of risk taking and there may be peer involvement of shoplifting. It may be something that people do on an infrequent basis developmentally, but it isn't a persistent concern that people have moving into their adult years. When people are in their general adult phase or middle adult phase and continuing in this behavior and can also process more the motivations for engaging in the behavior, because individuals with kleptomania may have the means to purchase what they might desire to have, but there is this tension, anxiety, unease that people experience that can then be relieved by the shoplifting or the stealing behavior. And they may feel guilty about it afterwards, remorseful. And it's something that is sometimes difficult for them to understand and for others to understand as well.
So what does treatment look like for someone with kleptomania?
There are no medications that have an FDA indication for kleptomania. Behavioral therapies, I would argue, are the mainstay. But speaking about my experience in the problem gambling field, many people with gambling disorder, and this is the case with kleptomania, experience co-occurring psychiatric disorders, and medications that have indications for the co-occurring psychiatric disorders can help not only improve the targeted domain, that co-occurring disorder, but with the co-occurring concern being adequately addressed, this can also help to reduce problem gambling severity. My understanding is that that would be a similar consideration.
When I think about somebody who, has the courage to identify that they have a problem in the first place, that something's going on, that's not normal, and then they seek help in the form of cognitive behavioral therapy, maybe medications that would address any co-occurring mental health conditions. I also think that they're up against a tremendous stigma. And I mean that not only on the outside, but within themselves. And I'd like just your human reaction to the challenge they're up against in terms of forgiveness of what they've done. It's not that they've killed anybody, but it doesn't feel great. They know that what they've done is not right in the eyes of our society and in a lot of moral ways as well. And I'd love your reflections on how maybe you'd like people who struggle with kleptomania to view themselves morally.
It's important for people with kleptomania to realize that kleptomania is a psychiatric concern that can be addressed. And in the treatment process, it's important for people to be compassionate towards themselves in the healing process and in moving forward with their lives.
You said that kleptomania is rare and it's difficult to study because it's rare. And so we've got these two people who joined us for the episode today who told their stories. And I'd like your reflections on what that can do for not only understanding kleptomania better for those who are in fields that could help, but for the general public. Why does it matter that they joined us today and told their stories?
Well, I think it's important to educate the public about what people are experiencing in the mental health concerns that people may be facing. And it's important to raise awareness so that people can be compassionate towards others, but hopefully to communicate stories of recovery that might be inspiring for others who may be facing similar challenges.
Well, I've asked everything I definitely needed to get to. Did I miss anything? Are there any gaping holes in our questions or any sort of open floor, any statement, that anything at all? It's all you.
So this is a less well communicated story that you are bringing to the public. And I think it's helpful to raise awareness and to try to have people understand that there is a place where they may seek help, gain help, and get to a better place.
Well, Dr. Mark Potenza, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you very much for covering this important topic.
When we get back, what does the compulsion to steal things like toilet paper and food feel like?
Saying it's like an itch that you can't scratch doesn't really do it justice.
Then a lawyer turned therapist finds his way back from an addiction to stealing.
I had to look at myself and go, whoa, addictions are tricky. They're complicated. They're hard to stop.
I'm Kyone Wolf. This is Audacious. Stay with me. This is Audacious. I'm Kyone Wolf. Today we're talking about kleptomania and the compulsion to steal. In a little bit, you'll meet a man who hoped to make up for his addiction to shoplifting by starting a research center for it. He also co-created a website that helps people pay stores back for what they stole. Kleptomania is rare and difficult to study, so some of the ways it presents may be surprising. For one woman, she says it manifested in connection with anorexia nervosa. Tabitha Farrar is an author and host of the Eating Disorder Recovery podcast. She also runs a coaching program for people of all ages who struggle with disordered eating. She'll be talking about her experience navigating an eating disorder, but I asked her to start off by telling me her earliest memory of stealing.
While I was at university, I had a raging eating disorder, and I started to get really, really weird about things that had never been a problem. And the main part of that is spending money. I started to feel huge anxiety about spending money. And I was earning money, but I couldn't spend it. I couldn't spend it on the strangest things. So I know it started with toilet paper, because when you first go to university, you've lived with your parents and they buy things like toilet paper and you don't even think about it. And then you go to university and you're like, oh, this actually costs money. And so with the toilet paper, I was just like, I can't bring myself to spend 50p on a toilet roll. And so I started stealing toilet paper from the university buildings. And that just started to progress. And then I started sort of taking food out of the fridges in university digs. So you have a shared kitchen area, and we were in dormitory style bedrooms. And I'd go into other buildings, and when nobody was in the kitchen area, I'd run in there and I'd steal milk. It was my, milk, things like that. And so it really started with just things that sort of were essentials. But the bit I want to get across is that it was not about money, not in the way you would think it would be. It's not that I didn't have it, I did. I just couldn't spend it. Spending it would bring crippling anxiety.
It sounds like there was a sense of scarcity involved in some way.
Absolutely. And that's what I like to do. People think that eating disorders, they think they know what eating disorders are about, and they don't. And what happens when your brain is, what you do when you have an eating disorder is you start restricting food. And that presents your reptile brain with the illusion of resource scarcity, not just food scarcity, but the brain kind of goes back into that caveman mode where it's like, if food is scarce, then everything's scarce. And you see so many behaviors with people with eating disorders that are brushed under the table. Kleptomania is just one of them. Hoarding is another one. Like, I used to hoard anything things that you wouldn't think would be reusable. I would make them reusable. I used to wash out Ziploc bags and hang them out to dry and hoard. And, feel very, very stressed if I had to use a new Ziploc bag. Just all about resources. And I turned into a workaholic, not unfortunately my schoolwork. The restaurant job that I had full-time alongside school, I couldn't take a day off. I would take all of the extra shifts. I would feel incredible stress. Even when my boss said, you need to take a day off, kid, I just felt like I can't do that. All the while, my rational brain knows, got plenty of money in the bank. What is your problem?
When you would steal something, from the toilet paper roll to anything else, can you talk about what would be going through your head, what would be going through your heart, your whole body?
Saying it's like an itch that you can't scratch doesn't really do it justice. It just feels like a little bit panicked, but also incredibly calm, and definitely adrenaline in there as well. And I didn't need to take anything particularly big to satisfy that compulsion, because I knew I was going to do it and I knew it was wrong and I didn't want to do it. And I'd feel huge grief and guilt afterwards for having done it. I would get myself to steal things that felt like they were the lowest value that I could. So I would go to the reduced section of a supermarket and I would steal an apple that had been reduced to 5p or something ridiculous. It was almost like I was trying to problem solve, like I had this compulsion, I had to take something from here, and negating it. And so it was a huge adrenaline rush while doing it, huge adrenaline rush coming out the store, and relief, because I did get caught a few times. That wasn't fun. It didn't stop me, unfortunately. You'd think it might.
When you would walk out of the store, that threshold moment where you're either going to get caught or you're going to get away with it.
Yeah.
What did that feel like?
It was really quite scary. And then you'd feel a huge amount of relief sort of afterwards. I can't really say that I was chasing that feeling. I can't say that that was what was driving the compulsion. I think relief was the overriding thing. And then disgust and, oh, for fuck's sake, I've done that again. Because as soon as I'd done it, I'd be like, not again. You're not doing it again. This is the last time. It's like typical mental health stuff. You're bargaining, promising yourself you're never going to do it again. And then you do, and you just feel like you've let yourself down. And it feels like a really disgusting thing to do.
Will you tell me about a time that you got caught?
Yeah. I stole a sachet of mushroom risotto. And I thought I was fine. I was really shocked. It was a huge shock when the security guy came up and grabbed me.
What did he say?
He was very nice. That one was very nice. Young lady, would you come with me? And he's like, can I look in your bag? And I was like, absolutely. And did you take this? I absolutely did. I wasn't trying to. I was mortified. I was so embarrassed. Talk about wanting the earth to swallow you up. I just felt so appalled at myself. And then there's that, oh God, what if my parents find out? What if my friends find out? I really felt like my world was going to end. They didn't press charges, probably because it was a packet of mushroom risotto.
Did you ever return an item that you stole?
Yes. Sometimes if I could, I would do that because, like I said, it's this compulsion. And sometimes I get out the store and be like, I don't even want this. And then I just take it in and put it back. And that always made me feel like, okay, I won the game today if I could do that. Sometimes, though, if it was something that wasn't perishable, toilet roll, things like that, I'd have this argument with myself. You should take it back. Oh, no, you'll use it. The hoarding sort of part came in and messed things up. But no, I would sometimes. Sometimes I'd take things back weeks later because I'd sort of want to know that the coast was clear and that everybody might have forgotten or if anybody had even noticed. Not that they would have, not really with the stuff that I took. But
who was the first person you either told about this or who found out about this?
I think I wrote it in a blog. I probably wrote it in a blog, and then I used to have a podcast about eating disorders and spoke about it then. So the first person was just everybody.
Why did you write about it?
Because it's so misunderstood and it's so common among eating disorders. And there's so much shame about it. And I got to the point with everything to do with my eating disorder that when I sort of worked out all of the reasons behind it and why my brain was doing these things, I really did get over the shame part. But because I coach people with eating disorders, so many of them struggled massively with the guilt and the shame around it. And because it's not talked about, they didn't really link it with their eating disorder. They just thought, I'm just this awful person. And I was like, no, this is what's going on in your brain. And that would bring so much relief because it is awful to think that you are this horrible, disgusting person. It took me a while to find that link. It was only really actually after I recovered from my eating disorder and the compulsion went away that I started to work it all out. And so that's why I think it's important to talk about it, because it helps people be motivated to recover. When people think that they are this disgusting individual that doesn't deserve anything, they're very unmotivated to try and recover. But when they start to see that all of the sort of negative things that they see about themselves are actually to do with the fact that they're restricting food, and it really does all come down to that, then they start to be like, oh, I can sort all this out. And that's super important to me.
Yeah, I think people, I can speak for myself that when I think about kleptomania and even my experiences with stealing, I definitely stole as a little kid. I remember I stole a ring from a store and my mom saw me playing with it. And she's like, where'd you get that ring? I'm like 5 years old. I couldn't have. So I stole a ring. I got arrested in Disney World for stealing a Tigger t-shirt. And when you were talking about the security guard catching you, I remember my security guard showing his badge and, ma'am, may I see inside your bag? And I was the same way as you. I was like, absolutely, yes. And he takes his shirt out and he's like, do you have a receipt for this? And I'm like, no. I'm getting arrested in Disney World. And I got arrested when I worked for CVS. I stole, there were damaged cigarettes and I smoked cigarettes at the time. And I figured because they were damaged and they would be sent back anyway, I lost my job for that.
So you know a little bit about that negotiation, sort of. No, this is like,
Certainly, but all this to say, when I think about my experiences with stealing, I think like it's so hard to put your finger on why. And I think for so many people, when they do, especially compulsively, there's not one reason why for everybody. And for you to draw this line between stealing and an eating disorder and hoarding, it makes me wonder what other compulsions we have that may tie into that.
Absolutely. I believe that there actually is always a reason why. I just think that we get so blindsided with just saying, that's a bad thing to do, that we don't step back unemotionally and look at it and be like, no, that's an interesting thing to do.
Right. It's not a moral issue necessarily.
No, I really don't see it like that. I certainly would have before I went through it, but I don't now. I just think, oh, that's interesting that your brain decided that that was an appropriate action to take. We have to work back the steps now and work out how your brain came to that conclusion. We just really have to take away judgment, because judgment just brings in so many strong emotions to do with good and bad that are really unhelpful and just unnecessary, actually. We're sort of conditioned to do that a little bit, I think, because we're just told this is about good behavior, this is a bad behavior. But I will say that the first time I was arrested, they were lovely. The second time, not so much.
What happened?
They shut me in a broom cupboard. It was actually a clothing store. And they shut me in a broom cupboard and for a long time, and just really quite mean to me. And I don't blame them for that either. I look at that and I'm like, I find that those things interesting. You know, that first security guard, he was really kind to me. He was very unemotional about it. The second ones, and there were more of them. And I think that group behavior, then when people see another person engage in a behavior that's considered antisocial or bad or wrong, that fear can cause them to be aggressive towards that person. And can't necessarily tell you why, but it's like because they want to reject that behavior themselves. That's a bad thing. I wouldn't do that.
And also demonstrate to the rest of the community that this is not acceptable.
This is unacceptable. And it causes them, you know, to be really aggressive almost around it, which, you know, at the time was quite scary. But now I look back on it, I'm like, that's kind of interesting, the different behaviors of different people. And I would have hoped, even when that was happening, and because it was I don't want to say the first time I got caught was a pleasant experience, but they were quite nice to me, honestly. And they just sort of gave me a little bit of a slap on the wrist and said, oh, well, do it again. The second time, it wasn't like that. They were really mean. They put me in a cell, not for ages, for a couple of hours, just to kind of scare me. They did all the fingerprinting. They made it, you know, we're going to press charges. It's going to be a big deal. It didn't, though, which was so disappointing to me that the very next day, I need to do it again. I was just like, you're kidding? What is wrong with me? I really wanted that, even when it was happening, and I was scared. And I thought, this is good. This is good. This is going to stop it. This is definitely going to stop it. It just didn't. It was wild.
You said that when your eating disorder began to get under control, then the kleptomania began to get under control as well. Was there a time where you were like, oh, this is the turning point?
Your brain changes a lot when you're in prolonged energy deficit, when your brain has not had enough food in many ways. Social aspects of your brain shut down. Your empathy sort of shuts down. These compulsions start up. And what started to happen as I started to what we call nutritionally rehabilitate, which is when you eat more and start to put weight on and your body starts to get better. What felt like this incredibly strong driving force behind these behaviors just started to feel less strong until the point one day I was like, I can override it. I still remember that, being able to be like, I had this compulsion to take something, but I think I can override it. And I did. I started to feel empathy coming back, which feels like it's a wonderful thing. It's actually not necessarily. When you've not had much empathy, and eating disorders make us incredibly self-absorbed and treat each other people, especially friends and family, not brilliantly. And so when you start to have empathy come back, you just have huge amounts of guilt, like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that thing to that person. I can't believe I treated that person like that. I mean, I didn't go to my best friend's wedding because I wanted to go to an exercise class instead. And, you know, at the time, in my disordered brain, that was totally legitimate. As soon as I started to recover, I'd look back on that and go, oh my God, I am the worst person ever. And so you start to have all of these, I noticed all these feelings come back as well. That's round about that time is when I noticed that I can override a lot of these compulsions. Like, it's still there, but it feels emptier than it did before. It feels like, rather than a brick wall that's non-negotiable, it feels like something I could probably knock over. And I just started to experiment with not engaging in not just those compulsions, but all of the other compulsions that I had with an eating disorder. And then once you've been able once to override it, you start to get confident. And, you know, then I'd make myself go into the stores that I hadn't let myself go into, because that was something I did. I was just not allowing myself to go into certain stores. And I'd be like, right, I'm going to go in there. And I'd go in there and be like, yeah, I'm not going to take anything. And didn't. And it almost came like, then I was sort of getting positive feedback emotionally for overriding it.
Do you wish in any way that you were caught more?
I don't know that it would have made any difference being caught more, because I would have thought that if that was going to help, twice would have helped. The second time I got caught, they did press charges, but the judge dropped them. I got an email from the court saying, "Judge has dropped your charges. She believes that the reasons behind your theft are psychological and believes that you should seek the help from a therapist," which of course I didn't do. I wish that they had actually forced me to engage in some. I don't know if it would have helped, honestly, because therapy for eating disorders is notoriously bad, but it might have, or it might have at least forced me to address my eating disorder, because at that point I wasn't at all interested in addressing my eating disorder, and I wasn't going to. I sometimes think that if something that my parents couldn't force me to address it. I was out of the house, so they couldn't force me to do anything. I feel like the justice system may have been able to force me to do it, address it in some way, shape, or form. I mean, they can force you to go, and in England, if you caught speeding, you go to like speed awareness classes. I can't remember if it's the same in America, but they can force you to do that sort of thing. So I thought, surely for stealing, they could have forced me to actually do some mandatory type of treatment. I don't know what, and I don't know that it would have been at all helpful, but it might have at least forced me to acknowledge that I had an eating disorder, which at that point I wasn't doing.
So it sounds like if you could go back in time and take yourself by the shoulders and shake yourself and say something, it sounds like you would have said, "You have an eating disorder. This compulsion to steal is directly related to that eating disorder." What else would you have said?
Once you get there, recovery is actually not that hard for most of us, and not even that big a deal. And you usually do it and they're like, "I wish I'd done that 10 years ago," because life is so much better, and usually rapidly so much better. And the reason that we don't do it is because we're afraid. We're just afraid. We're afraid of gaining weight. That's really what an eating disorder is about. And you can override, you can teach your brain to overcome that fear of weight gain. And once you've done that, it's just not a problem anymore. So, I don't see recovery from an eating disorder as anything that's particularly complicated. I wish I'd known that when I actually had one. That was the big reason I wouldn't even admit I had an eating disorder, because I knew if I admitted I had an eating disorder, I'd have to do something about it. And I was terrified of that.
Now that you are in a place of recovery, you feel like this is under control. You're helping other people who have the similar condition. Do you ever now, even for a second, feel like you want to steal something?
Not even for a second. And that's the same as all of the other disordered behaviors. I had a horrible exercise compulsion. It's just gone. It's just not there at all. It's the same with stealing. It's the same with the exercise compulsion. You really can make it so it's not like you're in recovery or you're still sort of trying to fight urges. You can make it so, because the brain is generating those urges for a reason. The brain is generating those urges because the brain's afraid of gaining weight. So it's giving you the urge to restrict food or the urge to compulsively exercise, because when the brain's afraid of something, the brain's job is to make us move away from that thing. And if you can teach your brain that weight gain is not a threat to you, if you can teach your brain out of that fear response, then the brain stops generating the urge to restrict and stops generating the urge to engage in body weight suppression behaviors. So that's why it can go away. If you understand that it's really just a big fear response, your brain's afraid of weight gain and your brain is acting accordingly, actually, by trying to motivate you to engage in behaviors that move you away from weight gain. If we just teach the brain and we build neural pathways that teach the brain weight gain is not a threat, then that fear response stops and the urge to engage in body weight suppression behavior stops. And that's why I say eating disorders aren't massively complicated, honestly, if you understand. It's just like a phobia level fear of weight gain. And the reason it's there is relatively unimportant. And we may never know. I mean, we do know a lot of it's genetic. So we do have that science now to help us understand that. But you absolutely can, because you can teach the brain anything. You can teach the brain out of a fear response. It takes work, but it's worth it. And so you absolutely can get yourself to the point where it's just not there anymore. It's not even lingering, which is a wonderful place to be.
Well, Tabitha Farrar, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you for putting these types of conversations out there. Very needed.
After the break, you'll hear from a therapist who's also a former shoplifter. He co-created a website that helps people return money to the stores they've stolen from.
there are people who really do feel guilty after the fact, and they want to make as safe and direct amend as possible.
I'm Kyone Wolf. This is Audacious. Stay tuned. This is Audacious. I'm Kyone Wolf. When Terry Schulman was 14, his parents had just gotten divorced, his family was on government assistance, and someone stole his bike. He was feeling like the world was against him. And then he walked into a convenience store in Detroit, Michigan.
And I noticed there was a bag of gumballs in a plastic bag that was kind of ripped open. And like I looked at it, and like before I knew it, and maybe I looked over my shoulder, I took one little gumball, and I can't recall if I put it in my mouth or my pocket, but I remember getting a little kind of a thrill maybe or something. And that was probably the first time I took anything from a store.
Then, when Terry was a senior in high school, he started taking art classes. And man, all the tools he needed from the art supply store were expensive.
It did begin to come a little more regular. Once I got away with it one time, and I would typically, take kind of a small item, again, typically art supplies if it was a little more than my budget could afford. And I always felt conflicted and guilty, and I was no master criminal. I'd shove it in my pocket or something. It was probably, I'm guessing, maybe 10 to 20 times that I had done this behavior during my senior year.
Then the urge to steal cooled down for Terry. But after a few years, his life started getting stressful again, so the thievery continued. Remember music stores where you could buy cassettes?
This is kind of ironic, but I'd taken a double cassette tape of Pink Floyd, The Wall, which is a classic double album about alienation and everything like that. And I don't know if it was symbolic, but I put it in my coat pocket. And as I was leaving the store, this particular store where I'd gotten away with it for a few times at least, the electronic gate apparently went off. And I just stopped like a deer in the headlights. Like, I didn't even know what was happening. I didn't know what an electronic gate was. And then I see this woman kind of running toward me, and I remember clumsily trying to take this cassette out of my pocket and throw it like behind the counter or something. And I was grabbed, brought back to the store. I was shaking, and I had three primary fears that were flashing through my mind very quickly. And these are in order of severity. One, that I'd be put in jail. That was my first fear. Two, that I'd be kicked out of school. That was even a larger fear. And believe it or not, my most dramatic fear was that my mom was going to find out.
Alas, he did not go to jail, but he did get a 6-month probation, and he had to pay a fine and do community service, but his mom did not find out. Years later, in his 20s, he started law school, and his dad, who had been struggling with various addictions, had a pretty serious stroke. The stress of school and his father's recovery and a romantic relationship that didn't work out reactivated his urge to steal.
So to put it bluntly, I was a pretty mixed up puppy. And I began to shoplift again, which was making me feel like a total hypocrite. Here I am in law school. I had a part-time job at our law library in the school building, and we were selling Xerox copy cards to people in the library so they can go, and we had $1 cards, we had $5 cards, we had $10 cards, we had $20 cards, and they had no real system for keeping track of it. And I would be selling some cards and pocketing. So I hit this bottom where it looked like nothing in my life was going the way I had hoped. I almost didn't recognize who I'd become.
He decided to tell his mom about the problem, and she was super supportive. He started seeing a therapist, and things were looking good. Until...
A week later, I was arrested for the second time. I was trying to shoplift a bottle of champagne under my overcoat in the winter of 1990 to somehow, in this ill thought out kind of plan, to bring it to my ex-girlfriend and try to make up. And I was nabbed. I was nabbed at the door.
And this time, the police came, took him to the station, and booked him.
Back in that day, they were using Polaroid cameras, and the first mugshot didn't come out so clear. So the guy threw it in the wastebasket, and when he went to get more film, I had just enough room to lean over with my left arm and pluck it out of the wastebasket and put it down my sweatpants.
Now, this champagne incident stayed on his record as a misdemeanor. Meanwhile, his insurance ran out with his therapist, and in their last session together, his therapist said something that blew his mind.
It was like out of a movie. He goes, "It's like you're addicted to this." I mean, he was literally exasperated. And I'd never thought of the word shoplifting and addiction in the same thought bubble.
And this reminded him instantly of his father.
I kind of thought of myself, I wouldn't say superior, but I kind of had sworn to myself I would never have any addictions. I don't want to be like my dad. But it made me have more compassion for my dad. I had to get off my high horse a little bit, and I had to look at myself and go, oh my God, whoa, addictions are tricky. They're complicated. They're hard to stop.
Terry began to interrogate why he had such a hard time stopping shoplifting.
I had a lot of anger. And somehow when I took something, I was feeling like I got back at life. I got even. Somehow I made life a little more fair. I felt entitled. I get it. Not right thinking, but I felt like I had suffered unduly, that I'd been a giving person. I felt underappreciated. Yeah, wow. I get it. I look back and I kind of cringe. Somehow it gave me a kind of a lift of power, made me feel like I was evening the score. And I was displacing my anger at the nameless, faceless stores, which unfortunately, both in the workplace and with shoplifting, but frankly, with a lot of theft, it's kind of unfortunately easy for people to depersonalize it.
So Terry started looking for a support group for people like him, but in the Detroit area, he couldn't find one. So he started one himself.
And I came up with the name CASA, C-A-S-A, Kleptomaniacs and Shoplifters Anonymous. Yes, I know kleptomania begins with the letter K, but I created the little Spanish acronym CASA, Mi Casa es Su Casa, a home.
Terry practiced law for 3 years and led this growing support group. But then he decided to go back to school to get his master's in social work. He began practicing in a drug and alcohol clinic and shifted course to specialize in helping people with their addiction to stealing. In 2004, he founded the Shulman Center for Compulsive Theft. And then something kind of magical happened.
I ended up going back to that art supply store that I shoplifted from. I'd already been in recovery for a few years, and I happened to pass the store. I hadn't been there in years, and I saw a going out of business sign. And I went back, and I wanted to pay them some money for what I had taken. And to make it worse, the guy who owned the store, even when I was shoplifting from it, had cerebral palsy and was in a wheelchair, and he had an older woman who was his attendant, but he was sharp as a tack, and he was still there. And I remember telling him, I don't know if you remember me, but in high school, probably several years ago, I bought things from, and I don't know if you remember me, but I said, I also want to say that I'm really sorry, but there were times where I actually took some things without paying for it. And I thought he was like going to yell at me or call the police, and then he literally said, clear as a bell, it's okay. And I said, please let me pay you. He said, no, it's okay.
Terry bought a few things from the store before leaving, but this interaction reminded him that there were no systems in place for him to just give the money back to the stores he stole from. Turns out he wasn't the only one who wanted a better way to do this. Together with Paul Guizdala, who he knew from his support group, they began the nonprofit unsteal.org. That's a website where people can anonymously return money to businesses they've stolen from.
Probably a few $1,000s a year gets deposited into a PayPal account from somebody. We don't take a fee, and we get it to the stores. But we're trying to get the word out a little more about it, because I don't know if there's anything quite like it. I don't think so. And there are people who really do feel guilty after the fact, and they want to make as safe and direct amend as possible. Because going to the store might be scary, because people are like, I'd like to go to the store, but are they going to call the police on me? And sometimes they do. And sometimes they yell at people, get the hell out of here. We don't want you, and then others like, thank you for making what we like to do, but we don't know.
What do you ring that up as? Right?
Yeah.
It's nothing. There's no PLU for that.
Right, exactly. So unsteal.org for anybody who's interested. It's a nice thing for yourself, or if you know anybody who might need to make an amend.
When you think back to that moment when you returned to the art store and you decided to pay the owner back, why did you really think you wanted to do it?
I feel a lot better about my life and myself when I'm not being dishonest. And when you have a little more peace and you forgive yourself and you have less judgment of other people and you start to think about your life in a different way and what legacy you want to live and how to work with the challenges of life that can throw at you at any point, it's actually more interesting and exciting than trying to get away with something for nothing.
I'm imagining you at a CVS and you're walking down the aisles and you see a young person with a bulky coat and they're palming a pack of AA batteries. If you were to walk up to them and say anything, what would you say?
I've been there. It's not worth it.
Would you hope they get caught?
Here's what I hope, that people get caught sooner rather than later. Because then, a lot of times when you go longer without having a pretty severe consequence, it gives more time for the addiction to kind of get in there. And then sometimes the consequence down the road is way more worse or whatever. Or when you are caught, you may be stopped for a while, but you might be more likely to do it again because you don't even realize that you've already crossed this invisible line and you've got the bug. And then there's always the question, should somebody be punished really hard, in some way, or let off the hook? And it varies. I've had clients who said, I was glad I got a light sentence, but kind of I wish I got a harder sentence because it was kind of like no big deal. But then I've heard other people say, man, for my first offense, they really hammered me. And then they get really cranky and then they want to go out and shoplift more. They want to get back at the system, So it's really complicated in a sense, but it's a full-time job having an addiction. Some are worse than others and some are more daily, but we live in a very addictive world for various reasons. And it just keeps coming.
Now, I bet if I asked you to talk directly to somebody who's hearing this and they know they have this active addiction to stealing, that you would say, get in touch with you, seek help. But I'm really curious as to what you would say to somebody who knows somebody who has this addiction and they are struggling with feelings of confusion and anger about all this towards that person. What would you tell them?
You're entitled to your judgments and your opinions for sure, but try to take a little pause. And if you're listening to this, maybe that will help you in that moment where you just say, well, wait a minute here, before I cut them out of my life or label them or go tell the whole world about them, just take a pause because they're probably hurting. There's probably something going on and they probably need help and love too.
Well, Terry Schulman, thank you so much for talking with me.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
If you're struggling with any mental health issues at all, you can always call the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Their free, confidential helpline is open 24/7 in English and Spanish at 1-800-662-HELP. We'll have a link to them and all of our guests at ctpublic.org/audacious. This show is always lovingly produced by Khalil Rahman, Jessica Severin DeMartinez, Meg Fitzgerald, Robin Doyon-Aitken, and Meg Dalton at Connecticut Public Radio in Hartford. Stay in touch with me on the socials at Kyone Wolf, and you can always send an email to audacious@ctpublic.org. Thanks for listening.